The road to Blue Ridge was quiet that morning. The early spring sun cast long shadows across the winding trail, and patches of mist still clung to the underbrush. David Reynolds tightened his grip on the steering wheel as his truck climbed the last bend toward the cemetery. The tires crunched against gravel, and the familiar wooden sign, Maple Grove Memorial Park, came into view, nestled among pine and hickory trees. It had been 3 years since his mother, Eleanor Reynolds, passed away. Every year since, David returned on this day, the anniversary of her death. This year was different. For the first time in almost a decade, all 3 Reynolds siblings would be together again, David, Michael, and Emily, gathering not just to honor their mother, but maybe in some way, to reconcile the growing silence between them. David parked his truck and stepped out. The crisp mountain air bit at his skin, and the scent of damp earth brought back memories of childhood hikes and Sunday picnics. As he walked along the gravel path, he spotted his younger sister Emily ahead, her auburn hair tied back in a loose ponytail, clutching a bouquet of white lilies. Michael, always punctual, was likely already at the grave. But as David approached the family plot, he noticed something that stopped him cold. A dog. A large golden-coated shepherd mix sat silently at the foot of Eleanor's grave, unmoving. Its fur was patchy in places, and its eyes had the clouded wisdom of old age. David slowed his pace, watching it carefully. The dog didn't bark, didn't growl. It merely looked up at him, and in that glance was something that unsettled him. Recognition? Expectation? Is that a stray? Emily whispered, stepping beside him. Not sure, David muttered. Michael stood at a distance, arms folded, watching with a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. He was already here when I got here, he said. Didn't move an inch. Looks like he's been here a while. The dog, Rusty, as the tag on its faded collar would later reveal, turned its head slightly, looking directly at David. There was something almost reverent in its posture, legs tucked neatly beneath its body, head slightly bowed. It wasn't just lying there, it was guarding something. David stepped closer to the grave and noticed the dog's gaze shift. It didn't appear aggressive, just protective. I've seen dogs hang around cemeteries, Michael added, shrugging. Probably gets food scraps from visitors. Or maybe someone dumped him up here. Emily knelt tous at the lily beside the headstone. The dog didn't flinch. He's not dirty, she murmured. And he doesn't look underfed. Someone cared for him. David examined the area around the grave more carefully. Something felt off. The ground on the right side of the headstone looked different, less firm, as though the soil had shifted. And the grass there was yellowed, wilted, unlike the surrounding lush green. Do you see this? He asked, pointing. Michael looked unimpressed. It's probably just runoff from the rain. This whole hill's uneven. No, David said slowly. This is sunken in. Not natural. Rusty stood up then slowly, as if sensing David's unease. He took a single step forward and sat again, closer to the right side of the grave now. His cloudy eyes didn't leave David. Emily noticed too. It's like he's showing you something, she whispered. David crouched and ran his hand over the patch of sunken earth. It was damp, more so than expected for early spring, and softer than the surrounding ground. When he pressed down, the soil yielded beneath his hand. I remember digging this grave, he said quietly. I stood here, watched them lower the casket. It was deep. 6 feet. So? Michael asked. This, David said, pressing again, is maybe 3 feet. 4 tops. Michael scoffed. You can't possibly know that. David didn't answer. His mind was already spinning. He stood slowly, his gaze drifting from the ground to Rusty's unmoving figure. The dog wasn't just present, he was anchored here. Waiting. I'm coming back tomorrow, David said abruptly. Emily looked at him. Alone. He nodded. I need to see something. Michael shook his head. You're reading too much into this. Maybe, David replied, but something's not right. I feel it. They stayed a while longer, lighting candles, whispering their own quiet prayers to a grave that suddenly didn't feel as familiar as it once had. Rusty didn't move. As the siblings walked back toward their vehicles, David turned around one last time. Rusty was still there, still watching. That night, sleep evaded him. He pulled out old photos, flipping through memories of his mother, her laugh, her strength, her stubbornness. He remembered how she always said, "The dead speak in silence, if you're willing to listen." And now he wondered, had he been deaf all along?
The next morning, David rose before dawn.
Armed with a flashlight, gloves, and a small gardening trowel, he returned to Maple Grove alone. Rusty was already there, lying in the same place, his eyes opening slowly as David approached. David knelt beside the right side of the grave and began to dig. The soil gave way easily, too easily. Not more than a few inches down, his trowel struck something hard.
Hollow. Metal.
David froze. It shouldn't have been this shallow. He reached forward and brushed more soil away with his hands. The unmistakable edge of a metal casket glinted in the morning light.
Rustillet out à l'eau, almost imperceptible wine.
David looked at him. "You knew," he whispered. "You've been here all this time because you knew." His breath caught in his throat. If this wasn't where his mother had been buried, then who was? And where was she? He stood up slowly, heart pounding. Whatever this was, he couldn't ignore it anymore. Not after what Rusty had shown him. The following day began with a different kind of stillness. Not the serene, comforting quiet David was used to in Blue Ridge, but the sort of hush that follows a realization too large to process.
The kind of silence that comes before the storm.
He couldn't sleep. After finding the casket far too shallow beneath the earth, he spent the night pacing his living room, going over the details in his head. It wasn't just a gut feeling anymore. Something was wrong, undeniably, tangibly wrong. And Rusty, the dog who had appeared out of nowhere, was the key to it. By 7 a.m., David was back at Maple Grove Cemetery. The sky was still gray, the clouds low, as if nature itself had lowered its gaze in anticipation. He parked his truck in the same spot and walked briskly toward his mother's grave. He carried with him a small spade and a pair of gloves. He wasn't sure what he would do, or how far he'd go. But he needed answers. Rusty was already there. The old dog sat exactly where David had left him, his head rising slightly as David approached. There was no tail wag, no bark of recognition.
Only the familiar, penetrating star. You've been here all night.
David asked quietly. Rusty blinked once, then slowly stood. He stretched, his joints stiff, and stepped aside, as if granting David permission.
David knelt at the cinquième patch over son sagen.
He ran his gloved hand across the soil, now dry at the top but still damp beneath. He dug, gently but steadily. He needed to be sure of what he had seen. A few inches down, he struck the same surface.
Hollow. Metal.
He cleared the dirt around it, exposing the upper ridge of a casket lid. It confirmed everything. This wasn't 6 feet deep. This wasn't regulation. It wasn't right. He sat back on his heels, staring down. The same question looped in his mind. Why? The sound of gravel crunching pulled David from his thoughts. He turned to see Emily walking toward him, a thermos of coffee in hand. "I figured you'd come back," she said, her voice soft but steady. He gestured to the disturbed ground. "I didn't imagine it." Emily stood over him and looked down at the exposed metal. Her breath caught.
That is too close to the surface.
David nodded. "Exactly. I think we were supposed to believe this was deeper. That everything was done properly." "You think there was a mistake?" "I don't know," he replied. "I just know this isn't where Mom should be." She crouched beside him. Rusty lay down again nearby, sighing heavily. "What do we do?" she asked. David hesitated. "I want to talk to Michael. We need to agree on something. This isn't just a detail anymore. It might be bigger than that." Later that afternoon, the siblings gathered at the Reynolds family home, a modest clapboard house that had sat quietly at the base of the ridge since before they were born. It felt smaller now, less like home and more like a room full of unspoken questions. Michael arrived last. He entered with a sigh and folded his arms the moment he saw the tension in David's eyes. "I'm guessing this isn't about sharing old memories," he said dryly.
David cut straight to the point.
"We need to exhume the grave." Michael's jaw clenched.
"You've got to be kidding."
"I'm not."
"I told you yesterday, this is madness."
"You can't just go around digging up graves because a dog stares at you weird."
Emily intervened.
"It's not just the dog, Michael.
The grave isn't deep enough.
David found the casket barely a few feet under. It's real. Michael looked between them, visibly conflicted.
You're not grave digger.
You don't know how these things are done. I know how deep a standard burial should be, David snapped. And I know what I saw.
Something is wrong.
Doesn't that matter to you? Michael was silent for a moment. You think Mom's not in that grave? I don't know what to think, David said. But if she isn't, then someone else is. And I need to find out.
Michael shook his head.
Do you realize what you're saying? You're accusing someone of, what?
Burying the wrong body? Swapping casket?
That's insane. I'm saying we need to know the truth, David said. We owe that to her. Don't we? A long pause followed. The air felt heavier than usual, and the ticking of the old wall clock seemed louder than it had in years. I'll file the request, David said finally. I'll do it legally.
No more digging.
But if you don't want to be part of it, fine. Michael didn't reply. He simply turned and left the house. That night, David filled out the official request with the local county office. A formal exhumation would take time, and it required family approval, but given the circumstances, suspicion of misidentification, it would likely be granted. 3 days later, permission was given. The exhumation was scheduled for the following morning. David stood at the cemetery gate just after dawn, watching as 2 men from the county's burial services arrived with equipment. Emily stood beside him, her hand clutching his sleeve. Michael had not responded to their messages. Rusty was there too, lying in the same spot as always. The workers had to coax him gently to the side so they could begin. David watched silently as the men began removing the soil, layer by layer. It took less than an hour to reach the casket. That's really shallow, one of the workers said under his breath. David felt his stomach twist. The casket was raised carefully and placed on a canvas stretcher. The county coroner arrived shortly after, and with gloved hands, he slowly opened the lid.
Silence fell.
David stepped forward, heart pounding. Inside the casket was a woman's body, small, pale, features delicate. But it wasn't Eleanor Reynolds. She was younger. Her hair, dark. Her hands, missing the rosary Eleanor always carried. And the necklace, Eleanor's silver cross, was gone. Emily gasped. That's not her. David stared, his mind refusing to catch up. He had buried a stranger. For 3 years, he had mourned someone who wasn't his mother. And now, the question became more urgent, more terrible than before. If this wasn't Eleanor Reynolds, then where was she? And who had orchestrated this? He turned slowly. Rusty sat a few feet away, watching him. And in that moment, David realized. The dog had always known. The image of the woman in the casket haunted David long after the lid was closed. Her face, though peaceful, was a stranger's. Not the woman who raised him, not the mother who used to hum old folk songs while folding laundry, or who cried softly at the kitchen sink after his father died. The body in that box didn't belong to Eleanor Reynolds. And yet, for 3 years, the entire family had grieved as if it did. Emily sat beside him on the front porch of the family home that evening, her fingers wrapped tightly around a mug of tea gone cold. Neither had spoken much since leaving the cemetery. The silence was heavy, thick with memories, questions, and the crushing realization that their mourning had been built on a lie. So where do we go from here? She asked, finally breaking the quiet. David leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, staring at the dusty boards beneath his boots. We start asking questions. The funeral home, the care facility where she was before. Someone has to know what happened. There's no way this just happened by accident. Emily hesitated. Do you think someone did this on purpose? David didn't answer right away. In his heart, the answer was yes. But he didn't want to say it out loud until he had proof. Later that night, David pulled out the manila folder where he kept all of his mother's medical documents from her final months. Discharge papers, hospice records, and one yellowed envelope from a small care facility just over the border in Vermont, Willow Hills Care Home. That was the last place she had been before the funeral home took over. David remembered the chaos of those final weeks. He had been traveling for work. Michael was moving his family cross-country. Emily had a newborn. Their mother's condition had deteriorated rapidly, so they'd placed their trust in a woman named Martha Coleman, a private caregiver recommended by one of the hospice nurses. She had taken over day-to-day care. She was warm, soft-spoken, always assuring them their mother was comfortable. It was Martha who had called them that morning, 3 years ago, to say Eleanor had passed in her sleep. It was Martha who said the funeral home had already collected the body. It was Martha who had said Eleanor's condition was too poor for a viewing. And none of them had questioned it. David stared at the printed intake form from Willow Hills. His mother had been admitted under her full name, Eleanor Reynolds. A discharge date was listed, but there was no destination filled in. Just a scribbled transferred.
Et circled it in red pen.
The next morning, David called the facility. A cheerful receptionist answered. Willow Hills Care Home, how can I help you? Hi, he began carefully. I'm looking for information about a former resident.
Eleanor Reynolds.
She was here about 3 years ago. There was a pause.
Let me check. One moment, please.
David waited, tapping his fingers against the kitchen counter. Rusty lay curled at his feet, having followed him home after the exhumation. David had half expected the dog to disappear now that the grave was empty, but instead, Rusty had curled up on the porch that night and refused to leave. Sir? The receptionist returned. Yes, we do have an Eleanor Reynolds on file. In fact, she's still here.
David froze. Still.
Yes. She's currently in our memory care unit. She was admitted as a Jindo initially, no listed family, but her chart was updated about 2 years ago with her full name.
Are you a relative?
He struggled to find his voice. I'm her son.
Another pause.
Would you like to come see her? David could barely respond. He hung up the phone and immediately called Emily. By noon they were in his truck, Rusty once again curled quietly in the back seat, as the hills of Virginia faded behind them and the roads led north. The drive to Vermont felt suspended in a strange, surreal haze. Emily sat in stunned silence beside him, processing the impossible. Their mother wasn't dead. She had been alive all this time, tucked away in a small care facility no more than 4 hours away. A phone call, an email, a visit, any of it might have changed everything. And they had done none of it. When they arrived at Willow Hills, the building looked warm and welcoming, with white siding, wraparound porches, and blooming flowers in the windowsills. A nurse greeted them at the front desk and led them down a long sunlit hallway to the memory care unit. She has good days and bad, the nurse said gently. Some moments of clarity, but mostly she stays quiet. Keeps to herself. David's heart pounded as they reached the last door on the left. The nurse opened it slowly. Inside, the room was simple. A bed, a bookshelf, a large window overlooking a garden. And in a chair by the window sat an elderly woman, her white hair tied loosely back, her frame frail but upright.
David stepped inside.
Mom, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The woman turned slowly. Her eyes, clouded by age and time, flicked toward him.
For a moment, nothing.
Then,
David.
Her voice was dry, almost a croak. But it was hers. David fell to his knees beside her, tears burning his eyes. Emily stood frozen in the doorway, hand over her mouth. I thought, David choked out. We thought you were gone. She blinked at him, confused. Gone. You've been here for 3 years. No one told us. We had a funeral. She smiled faintly. Martha took care of that, didn't she? David pulled back, stunned.
You knew.
Her eyes shifted away, toward the garden. Sophie needed somewhere to rest. Martha, she didn't have anyone else.
Sophie.
Emily asked, stepping forward.
Où est Sophie?
Eleanor closed her eyes. Martha's granddaughter. Died so young.
Nos places touburières.
Martha said I didn't have long. That I wouldn't mind if someone used my place. David's heart stopped. You agreed to that? She nodded faintly. She was so heartbroken. And I was tired. So tired. Silence settled over the room. Rusty let out a low whine from the hallway.
Eleanor's face up. Rusty?
He's here. David turned toward the door. Rusty padded quietly into the room and rested his head on Eleanor's knee. She reached out with trembling hands and stroked his fur. "He followed me," she murmured.
All the way here.
David swallowed hard. "He's been watching your grave for 3 years." Eleanor looked down at the dog.
Not my grave. Sophie's.
David rose to his feet, his mind reeling. Their mother had willingly given up her place in the world, for someone else's grief. Martha had lied, yes, but it wasn't a simple deception. It was something deeper, something that blurred the line between betrayal and love. And now, there were more questions than answers. Who was Sophie? Where was Martha? And how had it come to this? David looked out the window, the sun now high in the sky. His mother was alive. But the truth was only beginning to unfold. The ride back from Willow Hills was filled with silence, the kind that didn't ask to be broken. David kept his hands firmly on the wheel, staring ahead, eyes narrowed against the fading sunlight. Emily sat beside him, arms folded, occasionally glancing out the window but saying nothing. In the back seat, Rusty rested his head on his paws, breathing slow and steady, as if he had known all along that this journey would bring them here.
Eleanor Reynolds was alive.
That was the fact. The impossible fact. And yet, the implications were anything but simple. Their mother had been declared dead. A funeral had been held. A body, someone else's body, had been buried beneath her name. For 3 years, David and his siblings had mourned someone who wasn't theirs to mourn. And Eleanor, their real mother, had sat in a care home under the name Jindo, then Eleanor Reynolds, waiting for a visit that never came. David's hands tightened around the steering wheel. "Martha Coleman," he muttered. "She lied to us. She signed off on everything. She buried someone else in Mom's place and vanished." "She didn't just vanish," Emily replied quietly. "She kept visiting Mom. That nurse said someone left flowers. And Mom said it too."
Martha Cam.
David frowned. "That doesn't excuse what she did." "I'm not saying it does," Emily said. "But maybe. I don't know. Maybe we don't know the whole story yet." David didn't answer. He didn't want to admit how much that possibility unnerved him. Back at the house, the night fell quickly. Michael was already there when they arrived, standing on the porch with arms crossed. He hadn't come to the cemetery, hadn't answered calls or messages in days. But the look on his face told David he had heard enough. "Well?" Michael asked. David walked past him, up the steps, without a word. Emily followed, but paused beside her brother.
"She's alive," she said softly.
Michael's expression didn't change. "I heard." Inside, David laid out the documents on the kitchen table. Photos.
Medical record. A copy of the exhumation report.
The evidence was now too large to ignore. "We need to find Martha," he said. "She's the only one who can explain why she did this. Who the girl in the grave really was. And how she got away with it."
Michael scoffed. "You mean the woman you let take over everything when Mom got sick?"
"The one you trusted while the rest of us were busy with our lives." David didn't rise to the bait. "Yes. That Martha."
Emily sat down beside the papers.
"We have a name. We can start with public records. Maybe voter rolls, past addresses. Anything." "I'll call the funeral home," David added. "They must have had some paperwork. Martha had to sign something." Michael threw his hands up. "You're acting like this is some kind of criminal case." "It is," David replied calmly.
"We buried the wrong person under our mother's name.
Someone facilitated that."
Someone a hidé the truth."
"That's not just a mistake, Michael. That's fraud. And worse." Michael shook his head and walked away. David and Emily spent the next few hours tracing anything they could find on Martha Coleman. There was surprisingly little. No current address. No employment record after Willow Hills. A few older entries, a home she had rented in Fairfax, a nursing license that had expired just after Eleanor was admitted to the care home.
And then, nothing.
David called the funeral home the next morning. A tired-sounding director answered. "Reynolds family?"
"Yes, I remember."
That was a complicated case. David raised an eyebrow.
"Complicated how?"
"Well," the man continued, "the caregiver Martha, handled all the arrangements. We were told the family was unavailable, traveling, out of state. She provided documentation. Signed everything. Paid in cash, actually. Cash. David repeated. Every cent, the man confirmed. Unusual, but not unheard of. She said the family didn't want to be burdened.
The death certificate checked out.
And honestly, at that point, we just followed procedure. David's stomach churned. Did no one ever verify the identity of the deceased? There was a long pause. We rely on the caregiver's confirmation, especially if the person is under hospice care. It happens more often than you think. Most people don't want to see the body. David hung up the phone and stared at the wall. They had handed their trust to a stranger. They hadn't even asked to see their mother one last time. And Martha had used that trust to bury someone else. Later that day, Emily burst through the door holding a crumpled envelope. I found her, she said breathlessly. David stood. What? She had a P.O. box listed on an old property deed in Fairfax. I drove out there, and I spoke to the post office clerk. He said she still checks it. Every few weeks. He slipped this under the counter when no one was looking. She handed David the envelope.
No return address.
Just a note inside, handwritten in uneven cursive. If you're reading this, I'm sorry. I never meant for things to go this far. Sophie was all I had left. When she died, I didn't know what else to do. Your mother, she gave me something I could never repay.
A resting place for my child.
I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But please, don't take it out on her. David read it twice, then passed it silently to Emily.
Sophie, Emily whispered.
That's the name Mom mentioned. They stared at each other, piecing together the unthinkable truth. Martha's granddaughter, Sophie, must have died around the same time Eleanor fell gravely ill. Overwhelmed by grief, with no family, no money, and a body she couldn't bury, Martha made a choice. She took Eleanor's place.
Burier Sophie in her grave.
Hid Eleanor away in a care facility, under the assumption that no one would visit. That no one would know. David sat heavily at the table. We buried a stranger to save another family's grief, he murmured. Emily was quiet. She didn't mean to erase Mom. She just wanted Sophie to be at peace. And Mom agreed, David added bitterly. She knew. Emily sat beside him. What would you have done, if it were your child? No money, no family, no ground to bury her in. David didn't answer. He looked out the window. Rusty was sitting on the lawn again, staring up at the old oak tree where Eleanor used to hang wind chimes in the summer. The dog had known something was wrong. He had waited in silence, through seasons and storms, until the truth finally came to light. Now, that truth lay bare. But closure would not come easily. They still didn't know where Sophie had died, what her story was, or if Martha was still out there, watching them from some distant place, waiting for her own kind of forgiveness. David looked down at the letter once more. There was no signature.
No location.
Just grief, scrawled across a page by a woman who had run out of ways to say goodbye. And somewhere in that story, David realized, was the beginning of something deeper. Not just a mystery to solve, but a reckoning. A reckoning with what they had missed. And what they might yet have the courage to understand. The next morning, David arrived at Willow Hills Care Home alone. Emily had stayed behind to search for more clues about Sophie, and Michael still refused to be involved, claiming that reopening old wounds would do more harm than good. David didn't blame him. There was a part of himself that questioned everything too, whether unearthing these truths would lead to healing, or just deeper sorrow. But as he stepped inside the care home and was greeted by the soft scent of antiseptic and lavender, he reminded himself that this wasn't just about righting a legal wrong. It was about seeing his mother clearly again, for who she was, for what she had sacrificed, and for the truth she had chosen to carry alone. A nurse named Claire led him to Eleanor's room. As they walked, David noticed how quiet this wing was.
No télévision, no loud conversation.
Just the soft hum of oxygen machines and the slow shuffle of slippers on linoleum. She's been quieter since yesterday, Claire said softly. Sometimes these visits bring something up, old memories, old pain. But she asks for you by name now. David nodded, feeling a knot form in his chest. They reached the room, and Claire gently knocked before opening the door. Eleanor was sitting in the same chair by the window, her white hair combed back neatly, a shawl draped over her shoulders. She turned as he entered, and for a brief moment, her expression lit up. "David," she said, as if tasting the name on her tongue. "Hi, Mom," he replied, pulling a chair close to her.
Day sat in silence for a moment, watching the breeze steer the trees outside.
"I brought some pictures," David said, reaching into his satchel. He handed her a small album. Inside were photos from their childhood, picnics at the lake, birthdays in the backyard, Christmas mornings with messy hair and half-unwrapped gifts. Eleanor flipped through the pages slowly, her fingers trembling. Her eyes stopped on a picture of Rusty, lying next to a much younger version of herself on the porch. "He followed me everywhere," she whispered. "He still does," David said, nodding toward the doorway. Rusty was lying just outside, as if sensing his place. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, then back at David. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I wasn't supposed to see her die." David leaned in.
Sophie.
Eleanor nodded. "She was so small.
Just like you, when you were little."
Martha tried to hide it from me at first. Said everything would be fine. But when Sophie passed, she broke. Something in her just gave way. "She didn't tell us," David said gently. "No," Eleanor replied. "She asked me for something."
À place. À place to laisse Sophie to rest.
I didn't know what to say. I knew I was fading. I thought, maybe it wouldn't matter if I was remembered or not. Maybe it was enough that someone else's pain could be eased. David was quiet. His mother's voice, though frail, carried the weight of 3 years of silence. And beneath that silence lay something else, acceptance, perhaps even guilt, but not regret. "She buried her in your grave," David said, more to himself than her. "She didn't ask to take my name," Eleanor replied. "That was her decision. She told me she just needed time. A way to let Sophie go with dignity. I didn't think she'd run away from everything."
David exhaled.
"We thought you were gone. We held a funeral.
We cried for you."
"I know," Eleanor said. "I saw your names in the guest book. Martha brought it to me. She thought it would bring closure." David's throat tightened. "We thought we were doing the right thing. But we never came. We never questioned it." Eleanor placed a hand on his. Her fingers were cold, her skin paper-thin. "You were trying to live.
He never blamed you for that."
David sat with her until the sun began to dip below the horizon. When she grew tired, a nurse came to help her into bed. David stepped outside, needing air, needing space. Rusty followed. They walked to the far side of the care home, where a small garden had been planted, lilies, hydrangeas, lavender. A single bench sat beneath a willow tree, its branches swaying gently. David sat, and Rusty lay down beside him. There were still too many questions. Who was Sophie, truly? Why had she died? What had Martha been running from all these years? And why had David and his siblings accepted everything so blindly? Later that evening, Emily called. She had spent the day searching public health records, obituaries, and newspaper archives. Her voice was tight with emotion.
He found Sophie.
David sat upright. "Where?" "She died 3 years ago. Just a week before Mom was declared dead. No next of kin listed, just a name."
Sophie Coleman, age 21. Cause of death, overdose.
David closed his eyes. Drugs. Looks like she'd been in and out of the system.
Foster care.
Rehabs. A few arrests. And Martha, she wasn't her biological grandmother. David frowned. Then who? She was Sophie's caseworker.
From the foster system.
I found a note in one of the reports. Martha Coleman applied for guardianship when Sophie turned 16. She fought for her. Got it approved. David was silent. "She raised her," Emily continued. "Maybe not from birth, but she was the only family Sophie had." David felt a dull ache form in his chest. So much of what he'd imagined had been wrong. Martha hadn't been a thief or a con artist. She'd been a woman trying to give her foster daughter a proper farewell. And in doing so, she had made choices that had unraveled the lives of another family.
Choices made in desperation.
In grief.
In love twisted by loss.
We need to find her, David said. I know, Emily replied. But I think, maybe she doesn't want to be found. I don't care, David said. This doesn't end like this. We can't just bury the truth and move on. Not again. Rusty lifted his head and looked up at David, as if echoing the thought. That night, David returned to the care home to say goodbye for the evening. Eleanor was already asleep, her breathing soft and rhythmic. He watched her for a long time, then left a note on her bedside table.
Inderst now.
I don't know if I agree. But I understand.
El mij kitreikt.
He stepped out into the cool night air. The stars above Blue Ridge blinked quietly, indifferent to the lives shifting below them. David looked down at Rusty. We're not done, he said. And in the stillness, the old dog stood and followed without a sound. David returned to the house that night with a mission clearer than ever. He no longer doubted that Martha Coleman had acted out of grief, but that didn't change the weight of what she had done. She hadn't just buried someone else in Eleanor's grave, she had erased a living woman, chosen silence over truth, and left an entire family mourning a falsehood. It might have started with love, but it ended with a lie. Emily was waiting on the porch when he pulled up. I've been thinking, she said as he stepped out of the truck. If Martha didn't have family of her own, if Sophie was all she had, maybe she never left. David narrowed his eyes.
You mean she's still here?
Not here exactly, but somewhere nearby. Sophie's death certificate listed her last known address as a trailer park outside of Lexington. Guess who signed the emergency contact section? Martha, David answered immediately. Emily nodded. She listed herself as legal guardian. If she lost everything else, that trailer might be the last thing tying her to Sophie. David didn't hesitate. Let's go. They drove in silence, Rusty curled up in the back as usual, head on his paws, his breath shallow and steady. As they reached the outskirts of Lexington, the city gave way to small patches of farmland, broken fences, and gravel lots with mobile homes settled in uneven rows. The trailer park wasn't hard to find, Pine View Estates written in faded paint on a wooden sign that leaned precariously to one side. They parked and walked in. A man in overalls leaned against the fence, smoking a cigarette. David approached him.
Excuse-me, sir.
We're looking for someone.
Martha Coleman.
She used to live here, maybe still does. The man eyed them warily, then nodded slowly. Trailer 9. Been quiet a long time.
Woman comme gosse.
Keeps to herself. David thanked him and walked toward the trailer. Number 9 sat at the far end of the row, near a line of pine trees that looked as tired as the homes beside them. The trailer was small, old, but not abandoned. Curtains were drawn. A single planter with wilted daisies sat by the front step.
David stepped up and knocked.
No response.
Et knocked again. Martha? It's David Reynolds. Eleanor's son.
I know you're in there.
Silence.
We're not here to hurt you, Emily added, stepping beside him.
We just want to talk.
After a long pause, the door opened a crack. One eye peered through the gap, bloodshot, tired, but alert. Martha's voice came, quiet and scratchy.
You've nothing to say.
David didn't move. Then let me say something. You took care of my mother when we couldn't. You gave your life to a girl who needed someone.
I'm not here to punish you. I just want the truth.
A longer silence followed. Then the door opened fully. Martha had aged rapidly. Her once thick brown hair was now a mixture of gray and white. Her skin sagged, her frame thin, but her eyes, those held something sharp, something still alive. Come in, she said softly. The inside of the trailer was neat but sparse. A single worn couch. A framed photo of Sophie on the bookshelf. An old kettle on the stove. They sat across from her.
Rusty lay by the door, watching quietly.
David took a breath. We found my mother.
She's alive.
Martha nodded. I know. You visited her? Every week. Flowers. Sometimes I just sat in the hallway. Emily's voice was gentle. Why didn't you tell us? Martha leaned back in her chair, her hands shaking slightly. Because I was afraid. Because I was ashamed. I thought, maybe you'd never come back. Maybe you didn't want to. David's jaw clenched. That wasn't your decision to make. I know that now. David looked toward the photo of Sophie. Tell me about her. Martha's eyes softened. She was stubborn. Smart. Hurt. The kind of hurt that doesn't leave scars on the outside. She bounced through the system for years. When I met her, she was 14 and barely spoke a word. I don't know why she trusted me. But she did. She paused. I tried everything. Therapy.
À Stadium.
But the pain, it never let her go. She was clean for a while. Then she wasn't. And then one night, I found her. Gone. A tear rolled down her cheek. She didn't wipe it. She deserved more than a plastic tag in the morgue. I didn't have money. I didn't have family. Just
Eleanor.
She was dying. And she understood. She offered me her spot. Said she didn't need a name carved in stone to be remembered. David swallowed hard. But why not tell us? Why fake her death? Martha looked away. I didn't plan it. I panicked. I called the funeral home, told them Eleanor had passed. They didn't question me.
Everything happened so fast.
I thought, maybe if I handled it quietly, you'd move on.
That you wouldn't come.
But we did, David said, his voice low. We came every year. We cried at her grave. And she wasn't even in it. Martha nodded. And that's on me. Emily looked around the small room. You've lived like this ever since?
I lost my licence.
Couldn't go back to nursing. I didn't deserve to. So I stayed here.
Kept my head down.
And waited.
David leaned forward.
Waited for what? For someone to come knocking, she whispered. For someone to tell me it was over. That I could stop hiding. They sat in silence for a long time. Then David said, we had her exhumed.
The grave. We found Sophie. Martha's face crumpled, a mix of horror and relief.
You moved her. We had to, David said gently. We didn't know who she was. She's been reburied. Under her own name. Martha nodded slowly. Thank you. David stood. We're not here to report you. But we are going to make it right. With the state, with the records, with my mother. You have to come forward. Martha looked down at her hands. I will. He offered her a card.
Call me when you're ready. I'll go with you.
She took it, her fingers brushing his. As David and Emily left, Martha stepped out onto the porch. Rusty lingered behind for a moment, then walked over to her, nuzzling her leg gently. She bent down, stroked his head, and whispered something neither of them could hear. Back in the truck, David sat in silence for a long time before starting the engine. That didn't go how I expected, he admitted. Emily looked at him. No. It went better. And Rusty, as always, lay quietly in the back, his job still unfinished, but slowly, the truth he had guarded was finding its way home. For days after the visit to Martha's trailer, David felt like he was carrying the weight of two lives, his own, and the one his mother had unknowingly endured for the past 3 years. Eleanor Reynolds was still alive, living in the quiet confines of the Glenhaven Memory Care Center, and every visit with her now carried an added complexity, the knowledge that for years she had not been dead, but disappeared. Hidden. Forgotten by no choice of her own. And the woman who had kept her hidden was now somewhere between a criminal and a broken soul. Martha hadn't called yet. Emily tried to be patient, but David knew she was getting anxious. The longer Martha waited to come forward, the more complicated things became. Legal records, death certificates, burial rights, all of them were still incorrect. And although the state authorities had been discreet so far, it wouldn't be long before someone with a clipboard and a badge came knocking with harder questions. One afternoon, after another visit to his mother's care facility, where she had smiled at him like a stranger, then reached for his hand and called him by his father's name, David sat in his truck outside the local courthouse and stared down at the folder in his lap. Inside was everything they had uncovered: photographs of the grave, the exhumation papers, the DNA test results, and a new affidavit drafted by Emily. All they needed was Martha's signature to make the truth legally known. But she still hadn't called. Emily had a theory. She's not avoiding us because she's afraid. She's avoiding herself. David didn't disagree. Martha Coleman had built her life around saving others. And when she failed Sophie, Her grief had buried her alongside that mistake. That night, he drove back to Pine View Estates.
This time alone.
Rusty didn't stir as much anymore. The old dog spent more time sleeping now, his walks slower, his breathing heavier. But when David opened the truck door and reached into the back seat, Rusty opened his eyes and gave a tired thump of his tail.
You ready, boy?
David asked softly. The tail thumped again. Together, they walked up to Trailer 9. This time, David didn't knock. The door was already open. Inside, Martha sat at the small kitchen table, a stack of letters in front of her. She looked up as he entered but didn't seem surprised.
I thought you might come.
You didn't call. I didn't know what to say. David sat across from her.
Start with the truth.
On paper this time. Martha looked at the folder he placed in front of her. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Her eyes scanned the documents, stopping on the photo of the headstone they had replaced, the one that once read Eleanor Reynolds, now bearing Sophie's name instead. I didn't think anyone would notice, she whispered. I didn't think anyone would care. Well, you were wrong.
And you weren't alone.
She looked up sharply. David continued. You made a terrible mistake. But you didn't bury Eleanor out of cruelty. You buried her because you were drowning. That doesn't make it right. But it means something.
Martha's voice cracked.
It doesn't bring Sophie back. No. But it gives her back her name. That matters. Rusty had curled up by the table, resting his chin on Martha's shoe. She looked down, eyes welling with tears. You know, she said, the first time Sophie smiled at me, it was over this stupid dog. He'd wandered into the community center during a holiday dinner. Sophie was setting tables. Rusty bumped into a tray of rolls and knocked it over. I expected her to be annoyed. Instead, she laughed so hard she cried. She said it was the first thing all year that hadn't disappointed her. David smiled faintly. He's got a talent for that. Martha reached for the pen lying beside the folder. If I sign this, what happens next?
We take it to courthouse.
The coroner updates the death certificate. The state reissues records. And my mother, my actual living mother, gets her name back. And me. David hesitated.
I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe something.
But whatever it is, it'll be better than hiding. Martha nodded. Her signature was slow, careful, deliberate. When she was done, she placed the pen down and exhaled like she'd just run a mile. Thank you, she said. For what? For not hating me. David didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached down and scratched Rusty's ears. The old dog let out a soft grunt, eyes half closed. I don't think that's what this is about, David said at last. This isn't about hate or forgiveness. It's about telling the truth, and finally letting go of the lies we told ourselves to survive. As they stood to leave, Martha stopped him. Wait. There's something else. She walked to a drawer and pulled out a small box. Inside was a bundle of letters, most unopened. They were addressed to David, Emily, and even Eleanor.
All from Martha.
All written over the course of 3 years. I never mailed them, she said. Some were apologies. Some were just me trying to explain. I didn't know if they'd help. David took the box. Maybe they will. Maybe not. But they're yours. And they matter. As he stepped outside, the sun was setting over the ridge, casting gold through the pine trees. David looked back once. Martha stood in the doorway, watching them go. She looked older than before, but lighter somehow. Back in the truck, David placed the folder on the passenger seat and set the box beside it. Rusty hopped into the back, slower than before, but steady. As he started the engine, his phone buzzed. A text from Emily. Got word from Glenhaven. Mom asked for you. By name. David's hands tightened around the steering wheel. He didn't know if it was a memory breaking through or just a flicker of something deeper, muscle memory of love, of family. But it didn't matter. He was going. And this time, he wasn't going alone. As the truck rumbled back onto the highway, Rusty lay down behind him, his breath slow, his eyes closed, his body still. But his job, just like the journey, wasn't over yet. The road to Glenhaven was familiar now. David had driven it so many times in the past few weeks that he could almost navigate it blindfolded. But that morning, as he passed the wooden sign marking the entrance to the facility, a nervousness settled into his chest. His mother had asked for him by name. That fact alone was a kind of miracle. He parked under the shade of a willow tree. Rusty, curled in the back seat, lifted his head slightly but didn't move. Age had caught up with him, and David could see it in the slow blink of his eyes, the stiffness in his limbs. Still, he always insisted on coming along. David leaned into the back seat and scratched gently behind the dog's ears. "You can stay here, buddy.
You'll be quick."
But Rusty, as if he understood, slowly pushed himself upright and stepped down from the truck. David sighed and smiled. Some loyalties were unshakable. Inside the facility, the familiar scent of antiseptic and lavender filled the air. The receptionist greeted him with a soft nod. "She's in the solarium," she said quietly.
"She's been sitting by the window all morning.
"We told her you were coming." David thanked her and followed the polished hallway toward the room at the end. The solarium was a bright space, filled with soft chairs and large windows that overlooked the woods behind the building. It was a favorite of the residents, especially those who preferred the quiet. Eleanor sat in the corner, wrapped in a knitted shawl, her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun. She stared out the window, unmoving. Rusty approached first, his claws clicking softly against the tile floor. Eleanor turned at the sound. Her eyes focused, and for a moment, David saw the flicker of something more than just recognition. A shadow of memory, or maybe something older, instinct, maybe even love. "Rusty," she said, her voice raspy but clear. The dog wagged his tail slowly, then rested his chin on her knee. Eleanor's hand moved, almost of its own accord, and settled atop his head. Her fingers trembled slightly but didn't pull away. David stepped forward quietly. "Hi, Mom." She looked up, eyes moving across his face, trying to place it. Then she blinked.
Her lips parted slightly. "David."
He nodded. A small tear formed in the corner of his eye. "Yeah, it's me." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded, slowly, deliberately.
"You came back."
"I never stopped looking." She reached out and took his hand. Her grip was faint, but steady. In that moment, no words were needed. There was something deeper than recognition, something more primal. Connection. They sat in silence for a few minutes, Rusty resting between them. Finally, Eleanor said, "It was snowing."
"Il m'embêtait."
"When they took me away. There was a woman. Red hair. She was crying." David swallowed hard. "That was Martha. I think I scared her. I didn't mean to. I just couldn't remember who I was. Everything was dark." "You didn't scare her. She was already afraid. For you. For herself. She didn't know what to do." Eleanor nodded faintly. "It was like falling into a dream. One I couldn't wake up from." David squeezed her hand.
"You're awake now."
They talked for a while longer. Or rather, David talked. Eleanor listened, sometimes responding, sometimes simply holding his hand or stroking Rusty's fur. He told her about the letters Martha had written, about the mistake at the cemetery, and how it had all started with a dog who refused to leave a gravesite. When he mentioned the exhumation, Eleanor grew quiet. "Whose body was it?" she asked finally.
"Sophie. Martha's niece."
"She deserved more than that. She has it now. We made sure of it." Eleanor looked down at Rusty. "He never left?" "Not once." Her voice caught. "He always did like that hill."
David chuckled softly.
"I think he was waiting for you." A few hours later, David left her room with a quiet promise, to come back soon, to bring photos, to read her the letters she never received. She had smiled, a little stronger this time, and told him to bring her a donut next time. Strawberry glaze. It was the first real request she'd made in years. As David stepped outside, the late afternoon sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the ground. He helped Rusty back into the truck and paused for a moment before climbing in himself. There was still one more place he needed to go. He drove to the cemetery, the one where Sophie had once been buried under the wrong name. The groundskeeper had just finished cutting the grass, and the scent of fresh clippings lingered in the air. The new headstone had arrived last week. David had overseen it personally.
Sophie Anne Coleman. 1989-2022. Beloved nièce, Mr. Franc, Jean le Soul. At the base, a small engraving read, You were never forgotten.
Only hidden by grief. He knelt in front of the stone, pulled a letter from his coat pocket, and read aloud. Martha wanted to be here, he began. But she said she didn't know if she was strong enough yet. She asked me to tell you she's sorry. That she thinks about you every morning and dreams about you every night. His voice wavered. She said the only thing that got her through losing you was taking care of someone who reminded her of you. And that was my mom.
So in a way, you saved her.
Even after you were gone.
Rusty lay down beside the grave, eyes closed.
David reached out and scratched behind his ears. You know this old guy, he's the reason everything started. If he hadn't stayed by that hill, if he hadn't refused to leave, I wouldn't have known. None of us would have. So thank you, Sophie. For being loved enough that even a dog couldn't let you go. He sat there for a while, watching the breeze move through the trees. Rusty didn't move much, just rested quietly. Eventually, the sun dipped behind the hill, and the temperature dropped slightly. As he stood to leave, David noticed a small object leaning against the base of the headstone. A pressed wildflower, tied with a ribbon. He hadn't placed it there. He looked around the quiet grounds.
No one in sight.
But someone had come. Someone had remembered. Maybe Martha had come after all. He smiled, folded the letter, and placed it beneath the flower. That night, back at home, he let Rusty curl up beside the fireplace.
The dog breathed slow, shallow breath, eyes barely open.
David sat beside him and stroked his fur in silence. When Emily called later, he didn't answer. He didn't need to talk. Not yet. Instead, he whispered to the dog. You did good, Rusty. You brought us all home. Rusty's eyes flickered. He gave a weak wag of his tail. Then he rested his head against David's knee. And together, in the quiet warmth of a house no longer haunted by loss, they stayed until the fire burned low. David hadn't expected the flowers to keep coming. Each Sunday morning, like clockwork, a small bouquet of wildflowers appeared on Sophie's grave. Sometimes tied with twine, other times wrapped in old pages from books. No note.
No signature. Just flowers.
The cemetery staff had no answer. No one ever saw anyone leave them. It was as though the wind itself had carried them there.
David suspected Martha.
He hadn't seen her since the funeral reburial, but he had driven by her house once or twice. The curtains had been drawn, but the porch light was always on. One evening he left a letter in her mailbox, not asking questions, not pushing for a meeting, just sharing updates about Eleanor, about Rusty, about the way Sophie's grave no longer felt like a wound. She never replied. But the flowers kept coming. Back at Glenhaven, Eleanor's progress had plateaued. Some days she remembered his name right away. Other days, she simply smiled politely, treating him like a kind visitor. But there was peace in her now.
A stillness.
As if she'd finally put down the weight she'd carried for too long. David visited every other day. Sometimes he brought strawberry donuts, sometimes just a book to read to her. Once he showed her a photo of Rusty from years ago, tongue out, caught mid-run in a field of sunflowers. He used to chase butterflies, Eleanor murmured, almost to herself.
David froze.
What did you say? She blinked, as if surprised by her own words. I remember that field, she said softly. There was a barn. You used to catch grasshoppers and try to feed them to him. David laughed, startled and emotional. He never liked them.
No.
But you thought he did. You cried when he spit one out. They both laughed. It was the kind of memory David hadn't even realized he'd forgotten. But she hadn't. Not really. That night, as he walked out to his truck, he noticed Rusty was slower than usual. The dog's steps were careful, deliberate, as though each movement required thought. David helped him into the passenger seat, then sat behind the wheel for a long while, engine off, headlights off, watching the stars appear one by one. Something was ending. He could feel it. Not just in Rusty's breath, which came in shallow sighs now, but in the quiet that followed them wherever they went. It wasn't sadness. Not exactly. It was the stillness that comes when a story is nearly told. A few days later, Glen Haven's director called. "There's something you should see," she said. When David arrived, she handed him a small security flash drive. "Last night, about 2:30 a.m. Watch it when you're ready." David brought it home. He made a pot of tea, sat in the living room, and loaded the footage on his laptop. The video was grainy, black and white, time-stamped. At 2:31 a.m., a figure appeared at the facility's main gate. The camera caught only a side view, a woman in a long coat, hair tucked under a knit cap. She walked slowly, with a slight limp, carrying something under her arm. She paused at the gate, looked up toward the building, and waited. After a moment, she knelt and placed something gently on the ground just beyond the reach of the security lights. Then she turned and walked back into the shadows. David paused the video. His heart was thudding. He drove back to Glen Haven that evening, retracing the steps from the footage. The object she'd left was still there, nestled against the gate, a small handmade box, wrapped in worn fabric. He picked it up carefully. Inside were three things: a photograph of Sophie as a little girl, missing her front teeth, grinning wildly, holding a puppy in her arms, a simple necklace, the kind sold at roadside markets, made of blue glass beads, and a folded note.
David unfolded it slowly.
"I was supposed to protect her," it read. "Instead, I left her in a box under someone else's name. I thought I was giving her peace. I didn't know how wrong I was until I saw your mother's hands." There was no signature. But it didn't need one. David sat on the front steps of the facility for a long time, holding the box. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. But something inside him softened. A knot that had refused to come undone for years finally gave way. That night, Rusty didn't eat his dinner. He lay curled beside the hearth, as always, but his eyes stayed closed. His breath was faint. David sat beside him in silence, resting his hand on the old dog's back, feeling the slow rise and fall. "I know," he whispered. "You've done more than enough." The next morning, Rusty was gone. David buried him beneath the tree line at the edge of the property, just where the forest began to deepen. It was the same place he'd first found the wildflowers that had started all this. He dug the grave himself, wrapped Rusty in a wool blanket, and laid him down with a photo of Eleanor in her 20s tucked beside him. At the base of the grave, he placed a small wooden marker.
Rusty. Loyal franc, steadfast guide.
The dog who remembered. 4 days after, the house felt quieter. Not just empty, quiet. As if the walls themselves were mourning. David didn't play music. Didn't cook. Didn't call Emily back when she left a voicemail offering company. Instead, he returned to the cemetery. The flowers were still there. This time, he brought his own bouquet. And a notebook. He sat beside Sophie's headstone and began to write, not a report, not a case file but a story. He wrote about Martha's hands. The way they had trembled the day she'd confessed. The way she'd said, "I only wanted her to have a place." He wrote about Eleanor's eyes when she remembered butterflies. About Rusty's refusal to leave. He wrote about the box.
The photograph.
The necklace. He wrote until the sun dropped low behind the hills. In the final lines, he wrote, "There are stories that live in silence. Stories kept by dogs, by old women with weathered eyes, by names carved into stone. They do not cry out to be heard. But when we listen, really listen, they change us. They remind us what it means to be known, to be found, to be brought home." As he closed the notebook, a soft breeze rustled the grass around him. He looked up to see a young girl and her mother walking slowly between the graves. The girl stopped, pointed at Rusty's marker beneath the tree, and whispered something. Then she crouched down and left a single dandelion beside it.
David watched in silence, at full.
Somewhere far off, a crow called once, then was silent again.
The sun dipped, casting long golden streak through the trees.
A hush fell over the cemetery, a quiet not of emptiness, but of something sacred. Something kept. He gathered his things, stood slowly, and walked back to his truck. As he reached the gate, he turned one last time toward the hill, toward the rows of stone and earth and memory. And he smiled.
The story wasn't over.
Not yet. Winter passed gently that year in Blue Ridge. The snowfall was light, the winds forgiving, and spring came earlier than usual, riding in on the scent of thawed earth and blooming dogwoods. David spent more time outside. He walked the path from the cottage to the cemetery almost daily now, not always to visit, but often to simply pass through, to let his feet remember, to let his silence settle into the land like seeds. Eleanor was still at Glenhaven. Her memory came and went in tender bursts. There were days she remembered that David had a sister, that Sophie liked lemon candies, that Rusty used to bark in his sleep. Then there were days she mistook David for her brother, called him Thomas, asked when their mother would come home. But she was content. And that was enough. One afternoon, David brought her a small photo album. He had collected pictures from neighbors, distant relatives, old family boxes. In it were images of Eleanor as a teenager, Sophie as a toddler, Rusty as a puppy, and even a few faded Polaroids of the family's old blue house with the swing set still standing. She turned each page slowly, brushing her fingertips over the glossy memories as if she could feel the warmth through the ink. "You kept all this?" she asked. "I kept what I could," David replied. "The rest found its way back." Eleanor smiled. "Then maybe I can remember again too." That night, David sat at his desk and reread the journal he had written beside Sophie's grave. The words felt different now, not because they had changed, but because he had. The grief had softened, the guilt had been shouldered and reshaped, and in its place was something steadier. Peace. Hard-earned. Uneven. But real. In the final pages, he added something new, not a reflection, but a choice. He would stay. He had received offers to sell the land, offers to move back to Washington or California or somewhere the weather was less stubborn. But he had declined them all. There was something here that couldn't be replicated, a story buried in the soil, waiting to be lived rather than told. So, David began the process of turning the old barn into a retreat center. Not a commercial one, not something sleek or modern, but a quiet space for veterans, for caregivers, for those who had held too much and needed a place to set it down. He called it the Still Point. Emily helped with the planning. She visited more often, sometimes with her son, sometimes alone, and each time they came, she brought a calmness David hadn't realized he needed.